How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of How I Got Here. These are Mozio and PhocusWire's weekly inside stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Welcome everybody, regular listeners will know the format here. We have a guest each week and we kind of dive into their background and the history of the company. A slightly unusual one this week in that we're actually speaking to our guest this week is from a vendor who's working in one of, arguably one of the hottest sectors that's around at the moment. It's one of the reasons why we're talking to him. He's Michael Dridger. He's the co-founder, and the CEO of Operto, which was formerly known, some of you may know this, as Slick Spaces. He's based in Vancouver in Canada. So Operto is a property automation system in vacation rentals, private accommodation, call it what you like. It's a platform for managing short-term vacation rentals, hotels, and all types of guest accommodation. I guess particularly noteworthy and innovative is its lean towards the world of smart tech and the providers that it works with. So, it's arguably, as I said at the moment, a few moments ago, it's arguably in the right place at the right time as a startup, given the amount of buzz that has followed the private accommodation sector for the last few years, arguably the last 10 years, some might argue, since the emergence of Airbnb. But anyway, welcome, Michael, to How I Got Here. We're glad that you've been able to join us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Okay, so regular listeners will know we always start this podcast off with the very simple question, which is the title of the podcast. And tell us, Michael, how did you get here?
Well, I'm a buildings guy by training and nature. I started my own building and green building consulting company back in about 2012. And I was flying back and forth, trying to solve problems in mostly in the Middle East. I had a lot of really big projects in the Middle East. One of the projects I was working on was a hotel. There were actually 4 hotels on the project. And the energy was coming back from an energy consumption standpoint, very similar to the outpatient hospital that we were also doing. And I was completely baffled and thought it was wrong. But it turned out it was right. And the reason it's right is because it's 24/7 occupancy and nothing ever gets shut off. So I was, typical building consultant. I'm trying to figure out, well, how do we set it back? So the biggest problem was that the thermostat didn't connect to the booking systems or to anything else in the room. So if someone unlocked the door, I couldn't say, okay, that's a trigger to set it up, because those systems just didn't talk to each other. So I tried the consultant route, which was to work with, the biggest players in the world around building controls and access controls. And that was a dead end for about 2 years. And so in about 2016, I decided, let's just see if I can take the residential grade stuff that's out there and put it together into a solution. And that was around the time that Slick Spaces / Operto was sort of founded.
And how much personally was that a jump? As you say, you were in the consulting and you were trying to get your head around that part of it, to saying, okay, let's just do this as ourselves, as you say, originally as Slick Spaces.
Yeah, well, my background is in construction, so I did all the early days sort of installs myself. I had an apartment that I had turned into our office, and so I was testing things in the office, and I had a friend come by. Basically, what I had set up was a Nest thermostat and an August lock. And I basically got the August lock every time that it unlocked the door to set the thermostat up. And then I got it to turn back when you lock the door only from the outside. And they were like, well, that's amazing. And I was like, okay, well, do you have applications for this? And they were like, yeah, I have. My friends just bought an Airbnb in Victoria, and they'd love to be able to use it for this purpose and program codes to it. And so that's kind of how it started. So I had a client before the product was created. So you're doing something right when that happens. And it just took, I still run my consulting company called Edge Consultants, but it was so compelling and there was just so much interest in it that it took about, I would say, 18 months before I quit my job. It's hard to say quit your job when you own the company.
Right.
We stopped running the other company and got a really, really amazing engineering partner to run it for me. And yeah, so that's how I ended up transitioning. In about 2017 is when I sort of quit my job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No regrets, presumably.
No regrets, none whatsoever. This is it's definitely, and it's funny. Like, I meet a lot of software co-founders, and I don't fit the mold.
Okay, I was going to come on to a question about your co-founders shortly. I mean, it is an interesting one when you say that you had a customer before you had a product. I mean, did you get more customers before the product came along anyway? Or was it just that one?
It was really fast, because the first customer was essentially a property manager that was managing 5, 10, 15. And the thing was, around that time, and even now, these property managers are growing at incredible rates. We're really like a B2B company, so we mostly work with property managers. We do have the odd person who's just got one unit on Airbnb. You know, they own it, they live in one city, but their property's in another. But that's rare. Most of our clients are property managers, hoteliers, that kind of thing.
And lastly, for me, for a little while, I mean, was there a temptation to get into the hardware end of it?
There was from the like my co-founder is from I have two co-founders. One's from the world of like banking systems, like bank security and connecting bank systems, which was critical for me from a security standpoint. And my other was from sort of like the games world. He co-founded a company that did brain training games, and they had done
brain training games. That's a curious one.
And I know it's a curious one, but it's because I've been in the building industry my entire life. And if an interface doesn't work, people will defeat your systems.
Right.
You've seen it a million times. It's the reason, why people fight over the thermostat, right? So it was really critical for me that our UX UI just be like incredibly, like work for a 3-year-old and an 80-year-old, because that's essentially how guests accommodations work.
Yeah.
It couldn't really, like, the tech literally couldn't be an app, because my kids don't have access to a phone and my father doesn't use a phone, but he still books stuff on Airbnb and uses accommodation. So we had to figure out how to make a system that could be used by the entire guest, spectrum.
Okay, that's interesting, Dave.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to just, it's a good segue into figuring out, how did you think about onboarding these properties? For example, so you said in one of your examples was they had a Nest thermostat and an August lock. Did you basically, were you only able to work with properties that had Nest thermostats and August locks and were so somewhat, already modern upgraded, or were you able to come in and install them? Or, I'd love to kind of hear about what your onboarding process was like and is like now.
Yeah, it evolved over time. So early days, we also thought, okay, well, we should have an install team. It's very much like the home automation companies do, like Control4 or whatever. But then we just realized, okay, well, this doesn't really scale. And honestly, we're not as good at it as, say, our partner who does all of our installs now is Best Buy, right? Like, we couldn't we were getting requests from, Nashville, and Nashville's a long way from our offices in Vancouver. So it didn't even make sense for us to do that. And also, most of the stuff that we were choosing was stuff that, those guys could install. They could install a Nest thermostat and an August lock, or a Yale connected deadbolt, which is connected to the August system. So that's so we were doing our own installs for quite a while, but then we realized, we should just train nationally, national installers to be able to do this, and let's pick the national installers that sell the same gear. So that was.
So are you upselling these August locks then? Are you one of their main channels?
No. we are one of their main channels for sure. They do sell, like, so with Smart Things hubs, we work with Smart Things hubs, and they were selling lots of those. They're selling lots of Ecobee thermostats, that kind of thing. So we use them not just for install, but also for procurement. But we don't mark up any of the hardware because we're a software company.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe I think you have like a really interesting business because you're basically working with these PMSs on one side and plugging into everything on the technical side, and then doing hardware integrations on the other.
Yeah.
And I think take Mozio is a ground transportation aggregator, same kind of stuff, distribution partners on one side, suppliers on the other,
Mhm.
and there's no real hardware component to what we do, and that's hard enough. What have been some of the biggest challenges you have faced, honestly, like kind of melding two worlds together like that?
Yeah, no, and it's always like the scaling problems. Like you don't have a problem until you hit a certain scale, and then you go, "Wow, this hardware I didn't know it did." So like because we do everything based on codes, and the reason we did it based on codes is, as I said before, I want everyone to be able to enter and check in. So all check-in is done with a 4 or 6-digit code, and we were firing sometimes 15 codes a second at these locks, right? Because we got to put on all of the guest codes and the cleaner codes and the owner's code and all these other, and the systems were just never designed for that. So we were hitting code limits like really fast. And then as we've scaled to and gotten more and more diversity of project types, so for example, like like a common door in a 100 unit hotel, you're putting on that common door, like a common door, for example, like to the spa or to the pool. If you're at 100% occupancy, we're firing 100 codes at that lock, and we just had to find it. We ran into some really early day issues with the hardware as it was. It couldn't handle it, so we had to slowly learn how to channel things back on and off. And yeah, and there's more to it than that, right? Like you learn hard lessons around like the most appropriate locks to use even in those scenarios. And we've gotten really, so one of the things that we did was we had to internalize kind of like a design team, because you can't put like a closet door lock on a pool door, right? Like it's a disaster waiting to happen. So
Yeah.
we've become absolute lock experts, like even in codes. Like what's the code difference between what kind of door you need in Texas versus Arkansas versus Vancouver? We've had to learn those things over time, without supplying any of the hardware. So it's a unique space to be in, honestly.
So just one last follow-up question here. Like how much, with any aggregator, I feel like you're forced to make a decision between how much you cater to who you're aggregating and how much you force them to cater to you. Meaning, do you plug into their API or do you create an API that they plug into, which is, that those are the two extremes. I imagine there may be certain locks that you're like, okay, well, you don't need to have an August lock. There's these 17 locks that we support, or,
Yeah.
how do you think about how do you think about that trade-off, and how far were you like willing to go in accommodating and expanding the market for your services?
Oh, really far. I mean, most of the modern companies out there are putting an API out there, and we definitely, I would say, pushed a lot of those APIs to their limits and what they're meant to do. We've even actually done that on the software side. Like we had this hilarious discussion the other day about like, oh, there should be a standard around APIs, and I jokingly said, I would like to see standards in the travel industry on what a booking is, because we will get booking API data from different PMSs and OTAs that's completely different. So, and that really matters for us, because if a booking comes in as a single person that booked a single room, that's no problem. But if that single person booked 3 different rooms for 3 different peoples, I want to give 3 different sets of codes to them. But now I can't because the way you look at a booking is 1 credit card and 1 payment. So there's a lot. We're pushing it both on the hardware and the software side when it comes to like, okay, guys, you need to think about your API in a slightly different way. So it's a push-pull, David. It really is.
I'm interested, Michael, because it says you came across these kind of early problems with the code and stuff like that. Your 2 co-founders, Mark Baxter and Jason Lamb. What experience did they have in this particular area, or were they just one is a product design guy, usability, the other one is a tech and security guy? Did they have any experience in this, or were you kind of learning as you go along as a team?
Well, they had experience in how to interface with firmware and APIs and that kind of thing. And I was really, I mean, I knew the most about locks. You know, I'd worked in architecture companies for a long time, and I'd specified different lock type systems on. I knew how to read a door schedule, which is the architectural term for like what lock goes on what door. And I knew HVAC systems as well, like heating and ventilation systems, because I worked in green building. So I was kind of the bridge from the way things work at a UX UI level to the actual, like, how will it actually function?
Okay, and the other two had their own kind of skills that they brought to bear then.
Exactly, yeah. So when we were building a dashboard, I really wanted to make sure that it was something that was crafted entirely for hoteliers and property managers. Because I'm a big fan of dashboards because they can be done so well or so badly. Same with apps.
True.
Like
Yeah.
just so badly, right? Where it's like six clicks in to get to the thing that everyone wants to use, which means that no one can ever find it, and which is critically important. So like I worked on green building projects. I'll give you an example of why I say this, is that we designed all of these amazing, for example, on blinds on this one project. We designed these amazing blinds that were meant to go up and down as the sun came in, but they just disabled it because it was too confusing. No one understood how to run the system. So all of the savings and all of the light that they could have been getting and all the views they would have experienced, they just default had it down. No one could even look out the window. And it was like, wow. So I realized from a very early point of green buildings that if the interface isn't good, the solution that you've come up with just fails right away.
Oh, interesting. So tell me, I mean, none of the three of you had any kind of hospitality experience, as in the hospitality industry. What were your kind of first impressions when you were really starting out and you were trying to talk to property managers and, figuring out what their PMSs were like, and then you were having the same kind of some conversation, presumably with hotels. What did you think? Did you think it was a bit backwards in terms of where they were with things, or did that kind of reflect other types of building kind of owners?
Yeah, I was expecting a super sophisticated, and I was expecting a super sophisticated hotel world and a very sort of like, hey, let's figure this out, short-term rental world. And what I found was the complete opposite. The short-term rental industry is unbelievably sophisticated when it comes to tech, revenue management, pricing optimization. Like it's unbelievable. And SEO, SEM, and just even operationally, because they have to be so efficient. I mean, they don't have a centralized laundry like a hotel does. They have to be really clever and really smart about how they change bed sheets because they might have units all over the city. So that was a really big surprise to me. And the biggest challenge really was early days was on the hotel side was I didn't realize our biggest challenge was actually a fintech problem, because a lot of what was happening is the reason I didn't realize this is that the reason that the front desk stays around so long in hotels is because most of them are on very legacy payment systems that require you to physically collect the credit card. And that just doesn't exist in the short-term rental world because they're all on modern systems like Stripe and PayPal or whatever there is. So they don't have to physically collect credit card details from people. So the hotel industry is not.
So that's actually an interesting segue into something I've been thinking about. We interviewed Sonder on this podcast, I think a couple months ago, and there seems to be a convergence between the vacation rental world and hotels. Airbnb invested in Lyric. Many of these, there's like kind of this idea of this apartment hotel concept that's kind of something in between. And I think you probably have an interesting viewpoint on that convergence because you exist across both industries and kind of plugging in and kind of straddling that. So I'm curious how did you experience that? Because I know you started in one and went to the other. How have you viewed that convergence and your place in it?
It's funny because I don't feel like it really started to converge until about 18 months ago. And the atmosphere has really changed. Like I would go to a hotel conference and it would be very one way. And the only time they'd ever mentioned short-term rentals was in how hard they were lobbying against it. And then if you went to the short-term rental conferences, it was kind of like, well, we're just trying to figure out regulation. We want regulation because at least we know what's happening. But lately, it's changed completely. Like I'm seeing now conferences come out this year that are both. It's just like accommodation, short-term, like accommodation and long-term, and hotels. And the hotel, I mean, Marriott was the first to really get into it in any real way with Marriott Homes and Villas. But I think you're going to see more of that in the next little while. Yeah, it's happening really fast. And I mean, for me, it felt obvious because, like I said, I'm a buildings guy, and for me, a door is a door, and a guest is a guest. It doesn't really matter if it's a tree house or a 5-star hotel. It's kind of the same problem.
But from the deal making side, I imagine it's definitely a little different. I mean, I think about, we've talked to Travel Bank and Amex GBT, and there's completely separate problems that a massive corporation faces versus an SMB, and I imagine you have completely separate problems that you're pitching into a hotel versus like you said, a small Airbnb set of Airbnbs. And how has it affected your business? How do you think about selling to these various different entities?
That's a really good question. I mean, we still have a lot of short-term rental companies like Sonder that we work with that have structures very similar to the large hotel chains. So we are used to going through that process. But I think it's less about the sales cycle and more about, for the hotels anyway, and more about the paradigm shift. They're really struggling with the fact that they're actually the same thing. Short-term rentals and hotels, they really think it's very, very different. And the reason they think it's very, very different is because everything is in one spot, right? There's a check-in desk with a whole set of buildings, or a whole set of units inside of a single building. So I think once they overcome that paradigm shift, they'll realize that they're the same thing. It's just perception. It's not reality.
Yeah, it reminds me of kind of stuff in the ground transportation world where everyone's like, Uber is a completely separate thing. And I think a lot of the traditional players didn't really respect that. Like, to most consumers, a place to stay is a place to stay. A ride is a ride. And the things that they were distinguishing were mainly on the fringes and things only industry people really cared about. And for 95% of people, they didn't really care. So I think it's an interesting transformation. Sorry, I think I cut you off, Kevin.
Yeah.
No. I'm interested in kind of the structure of the company. So, three of you as founders, how have you kind of built up the company from a headcount perspective? Because in some respects, those in the vendor end of the world, the software end of the world, obviously they have their core tech team, but everything else is a kind of business development and basically trying to sell the product. I mean, how have you kind of split it up around the departments?
Yeah, so our biggest department is definitely the development team that's designing to the APIs of either the OTAs, the PMSs, the constantly growing locks and thermostats and air quality monitors and all those things that we connect to. That's our biggest department, obviously. Our second biggest is customer success, just because a lot of, like, even when the onboarding goes really well, these are new systems and people do get confused really easily, because when you go from a 4th century BC lock with a key to a 21st century digital lock, it's a big leap for a lot of companies. So they do a lot of trainings, a lot of webinars, a lot of like walking people through, okay, you don't have to do anything now. It'll automatically send a 4-digit access code through. Yeah. So that's our second biggest team. Our sales team's really small, because most of our inquiries are inbound from our PMS partners. We're now connected to, I think it's 14 PMSs. And so they just mostly deal with inbound traffic, and people interested in that connection and what it brings them in terms of, freeing up their time.
Okay, so talk to us a little bit about the rebrand. Why did you do that? And that was, fairly early on in the business. Was that a kind of a eye roll moment? Oh, we just picked the wrong name here, or was there something a little bit more strategic behind it? I mean, not many startups change their branding so quickly into their lives, if at all.
Yeah, we wanted something much smaller, much more international. Like I lived in Japan for quite a while, and they can't say L very well, and then so we just wanted something really easy to say as well.
They can't
Um,
say the letter L, did you say?
Not very well.
So it
It's
would be six
I do you,
spaces.
Ravi Ruro. Yeah, it was Slick Spaces was a bad one.
Yeah.
And you know how it is early days. Like I had another co-founder who really loved the name, and it's one of those compromises where you're like, okay, fine, let's just do it. But I really grew to dislike it over time, and so the moment that we had a chance to have the conversation about changing it, I pushed very hard for it to be changed to something that was just a little bit more memorable. We could get it was shorter for a .com, and that could be seen as more of an international brand. We were also getting confused as Slick Spaces as a property manager.
Yeah.
People thought we were a property manager, and so I want to remove that confusion as well.
Okay. And you're based in Vancouver. I mean,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about the in inverted commas startup community there in either in Canada or on that kind of west coast where you are, and how that compares in your experience from dealing with other startups to other startup areas such as the Valley and places over in Europe.
Yeah, well, we're definitely not the Valley, or Toronto, if you're familiar with the other large Canadian city. I mean, Toronto is has a very vibrant startup community in Canada. Vancouver's is still pretty small. It's very, very small. We have some really big some big offices, like Microsoft has a big office here,
Yeah.
and Amazon has a big, but they really just use it as a launching point. They did for a while as a launching point to bring people into their US offices. And now that that's gotten harder, they've just grown them here. So we have well-established tech companies that are large here, but our startup community is really, I mean, there's not a lot of venture capital companies out here except for in Seattle and California. So what happens quite often is they'll move out of Vancouver. So like Stuart Butterfield, for example, he moved out of here a long time ago to start Slack. There's lots of those sort of stories. So it definitely was hard. And we definitely had to fight to stay here because it's kind of, I jokingly say it's an outpost town. It really is an outpost town. It's a lovely outpost town though.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. Sadly, I've not been to Canada. I must put it on my list. I mean, but I guess a more serious point around startups and things like that. I mean, talk to us about fundraising, if at all, how much, and any of the challenges that you may have kind of come across by virtue of being in in your words, the outpost, if that has been a factor.
Yeah, the only thing that people were used to, so when it came to like the angel round, the only thing people had ever really invested in here were like oil and gas companies, timber companies,
Yep.
people that were doing some a little, in the healthcare world, there was some of that. The odd fintech thing. So what we were doing in the world of prop tech in 2016, prop tech, they'd never heard of it. So it was really, really challenging early days. So, I had to do I got a very untypical thing for a startup. I got a loan from something called the BDC, which is the Development Bank of Canada, just to keep things going. Which ended up being a great thing to do. And then when we were raising, we did have to go to the US quite a bit. But then halfway through the raise, Darren Houston, the former CEO of Booking.com, he came in and said, I'll help fund multiple rounds. And so he led the first round of about 5 million in 2018. And that was kind of the launching point for us to really grow the teams out and figure out other countries. Because before that, we'd had the odd customer in Europe and the odd customer in Japan, but we couldn't really dedicate resources to solving anything at any real scale for them. But now we've been able to, so we're opening up an office in Europe in May, and yeah, we've had clients that are scaling in Australia and that kind of thing. So
okay, Dave?
And that's only been the last little while since you can't do very much without money, sadly.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned a couple times, I noticed you alluded to, interfaces and problems with interfaces and your learnings around that. And this is a little bit potentially off-piste here, but it seems to be something that interests you a lot. So I kind of wanted to, see if, how you thought about that as related to your business and, designing for all these different use cases, but just in general, like how you think about user interface.
Yeah, so I've been in a lot of smart homes that were like small nightmares, where the light switch looks like a piece of glass, and you got to tap it 5 times on one corner to turn on lights in one corner, and 3 times on the other. And even if I lived there, I don't think I'd be able to figure it out. So I've always been a big believer that a light switch is a light switch and shouldn't look like a control panel for the Starship Enterprise. And that's that's the basics of it. I think it's because of I grew up in Saskatchewan, which is middle of Canada. My last name's Mennonite, which is kind of like the Amish, like German Amish. So I've always I had a upbringing of very simple things, and doing things very simply. And I think that, and then when I started working in architecture, I worked for very modernist firms that liked very simple lines, very simple everything. So I have a modernist Mennonite aesthetic when it comes to interfaces. Just quite probably, I don't know. I'm probably the only person with that combination of preferences. But yeah, so that's for me that's a big thing.
Okay, so last one from us then, Michael. I mean, it's interesting to me because you are so, and I don't like to end on a kind of a downbeat note, but I'm curious because you are so reliant on things that arguably are out of your control. My sense is that, so whether it's lock standards or whether it's reservation system standards or lack of and things like that. I mean, what is the kind of the biggest potential disruptor to the business or indeed the progress of the business, given that you are reliant on so many things that you don't have control over?
Yeah, well, I chose only the largest companies in the world in every category of the hardware providers I was working in. Because there's definitely that worry that if this lock manufacturer goes out of business, then I won't be able to service it. But I'm working with Yale, Assa Abloy, which is, their market cap is larger than IKEA's.
Right.
They're massive. And then the hubs we were working with, early days were from Samsung, right? So you always have to mitigate that. And I've always sort of felt that control is a bit of an illusion anyway. Even in any sort of vertical, you're sort of at the mercy of the way things swing. But I think for us, as you mentioned at the beginning, this is where things are going. It's pretty clear in terms of IoT. So I don't think that IoT is going away anytime soon. The biggest concerns were definitely early days that a particular IoT provider would go out of business, which is why we made our strategic decisions early to only work with private, publicly held companies that have been around for a long time, like Samsung and Assa Abloy. And
that makes a lot. It makes a lot of sense. So, thank you very much, Michael, for joining David and I on this particular episode of How I Got Here. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, guys.
Okay, so regular listeners will know we'll be back next week with another episode of How I Got Here. You can follow us on Twitter, which is The High Podcast. We're also on Instagram and we're also on Facebook. And you can read these stories and the episodes that we cover both on PhocusWire.com and on Mozio as well. So look out for this episode and look out for our next episodes. And we're into the 20s now, the numbers that we have recorded. So the back catalogue is all there. So, and we've interviewed some some fascinating innovators and people in the industry over the course of the last 6 months or so. So keep tuning in. Thanks again ever so much to Michael, and thanks ever so much from us to the audience as always, from David and I. We'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more inside stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages. And get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.